Hey, what's going on, everybody? Today is February 22nd, 2024, and you're listening and watching the Daily AI Show live. And today we are talking about the US and whether it's got a global dominance in AI. What does that mean? What's going on with that? And where this show came from was a article that Karl had actually shared from the CEO of Palantir. And basically what he said, and we'll get into this, was within 10 years, around 90%, 95% of the world's top tech companies will be American, thanks to the US lead in AI. And then he said, very large, but that will benefit only a handful of companies. Okay, so then there's a whole lot of the stuff that goes into it. So that's sort of the nugget that we're starting from, is just sort of talking about where the US currently is as far as, if you want to call it AI dominance. Who else is out there, between China and different, Mistral and France and different countries like that. And will anything really change in the next, it says within 10 years, it was his quote. So we can dive into all that. We got Beth, Andy, Jyunmi. I'm Brian, and we'll see if anybody else pops in. Maybe Karl. I think that would be the only other one today. And just kind of want to kick this off. So does anybody have any sort of like top of the show notes? Andy does. All right. I figured you might, Andy.
I've got some numbers for us.
Yeah, so I love it. I figured you would. Go for it.
So what I did is there's a global AI index that's tracking the level of investment cumulatively and by year for all of the countries in the world. There's a beautiful graphic display of this at a place called tortoisemedia.com. I just saw that before the show started here. But what I did is I asked Perplexity what the AI investment was for the top 10 countries. And then I asked it to give me the GDP of those countries. And then I had ChatGPT give me a table with the investment in AI, cumulative investment in AI now, as a percentage of GDP. So there's some interesting things that pop out of that. First of all, as you might imagine, the leaders in AI investment are the United States and China. Mm-hmm. But the total investment cumulatively to date by the United States is $250 billion, and in China, $95 billion. So about 2.5 times as much investment in the United States as compared to China. But when you flip it to be as a percentage of GDP, some interesting things come out. Any guesses on who the leader in AI investment as a percent of GDP is? None. Israel.
France?
Israel.
Oh.
So the United States, with $250 billion of investment, is about 0.8%, or call it 1% of GDP, has been invested to date. So you take a static number, GDP annually, and then cumulative investment. So it's not like that's how much we're spending, like NATO has to spend 2% per annum of their GDP and that sort of thing. But so Israel is at almost 3% of their GDP invested, which is really 3 times as much as what the United States is investing on a per capita basis, if you will. Because I would say that probably Israel's GDP per capita is probably similar, to as are most of the developed countries, I suspect. The second one is Singapore with 1% of its GDP, very similar to the United States. And then following in close succession after the United States at 0.8% are the United Kingdom with 0.6%, Canada with 0.4%, and then China comes in at 0.36%. So because of the enormity of the Chinese population, there's a smaller percentage of GDP, but nonetheless, it's a very substantial investment in GDP, in AI rather. And then the other thing is that since this is a cumulative number, it doesn't really show the acceleration. And we know in a command economy like China's, they could ramp up very, very rapidly. They could decide to pour a ton of money into their AI, and I'm sure they have already. They lead in terms of the average amount of money given to a single startup. So the average amount that's been given to startups in China in 2022 was the leader of the pack. So they gave $71 million per startup to get those things off the ground. So that gives you some background numbers to play with. Definitely, it is the case that confirming evidence that the U.S. is leading the pack when it comes to AI investment.
So this didn't come up in yesterday's show, but Singapore announced 2 days ago a $1 billion 5-year investment plan in AI. I don't know that that's showing up in the numbers, but but what you're saying is that Singapore is absolutely having its eye on this, and I think that's just further evidence of that.
Yeah.
Also, not from yesterday's show, but something that Microsoft announced is they're investing 5.6 billion in Europe in general around AI, with I think a little less than half going to Spain and other countries. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
So
Microsoft is probably one of the top countries in the world.
so
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
so
Exactly.
is
Well, that's
California.
another point, right? Another point is the premise when we say investment by U.S. or China or France and things like that. This is more just talking about companies that are
In
headquartered
those
in
countries, that's right.
in those countries. We're not talking about not necessarily talking about the countries themselves, which certainly they do. That's things like not necessarily AI, but when the Chips Act was passed, that's like $280 billion are going to be spent on chip manufacturing and things like that. But my point is that these companies are global and international already, and so I just want to make sure there's a clear difference when we're talking about what is a country's investment in AI and what is a company that just happens to be headquartered in a country's investment in AI.
So, Carl, just a second. So, when Andy reads those numbers and shares those numbers, the number, if Microsoft is a part of those numbers, it's not, and Microsoft is increasing investment in growing in the UK or Europe. That's still considered U.S. part of GDP in those numbers because Microsoft is headquartered here, even though it's international. Is that
I
true?
believe that's true.
Okay,
Mm,
thanks.
okay.
Carl.
Now, it could be the case that Microsoft has a UK subsidiary that is also making investments. So, there might be
Got it.
Microsoft might be contributing to a number of those buckets.
Okay.
The one thing so Jyunmi was talking about chips. It's funny, and one of the things that I wanted to bring attention to, this was a couple weeks ago by Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, where he was saying like every single country should have its own kind of AI, right? AI sovereignty. It refers to the strategic development deployment of AI technology to protect national security, economic competitiveness, and societal well-being. This is in contrast to corporate-controlled AI, which is developed primarily for the best interests of the company rather than the state. So if you look at it on the whole, you could argue, oh, China is kind of on that path where, since the government controls pretty much everything, they have sovereignty over their AI versus something like the United States, any Western countries where it's like OpenAI and Google controls the AI. So I can boil it down to something like I'm always a big advocate of businesses creating their own co-pilots to run their own businesses. To me, this is like, hey, each country should have its own. I don't even know how that's even going to work, and I don't think some countries can even
Yeah.
have that type of. Just no way. They would need the compute power, the resources, the people to actually do that. That's just not possible for some countries. So it again, like it goes back to U.S. dominated because these companies are US based. So Google and OpenAI and Microsoft, they're the ones running it. Meta, Anthropic, I don't, besides open source, who are the other players that can actually like offer something to the world?
Well, some of the companies that I pulled up that are Europe based, not this isn't obviously inclusive of the whole world. I just did Europe, but some that we would know are Shift Technology, Synthesia, Mistral, Stability AI. Stability AI is in UK, Mistral in France, Synthesia is UK, Shift is France. A couple others come up in Germany that I'm not familiar with their names. One relocated, Poolside AI relocated from the US to Paris. So France, I would say first UK and then Germany, based on this quick list. Of course, it's not inclusive and it's not data that I would build anything off of. But I do think there's something to be said for, tech hubs. There's a reason that despite all the maybe problems of living in San Francisco, it continues to be a place that startups start up. And that's like because who are your neighbors, right? So there's a lot to be said for having close proximity to other startups, other working knowledge of how to start that up, and that obviously can lead to a lot of success. And I wonder, I don't hear about them, and it's maybe my ignorance on this, but I don't hear about necessarily those same levels of quote unquote tech hubs where I think it's much easier to incubate and get a startup off the ground if you're in some of these areas in the US because they have a track record of success. And again, it's why people continue to move to San Francisco, despite the fact that San Francisco is a very hard place to start, to like financially start up and have workers work and live. That's why we hear the stories about people living in their cars and the Google stories and stuff like that. So why isn't that happening in Montana? Well, I'm sure some are, but there's probably a really good reason why that doesn't continue to happen. Obviously, the United States is massively large comparative to other countries, so that's probably part of it too. But it does beg the question, like Europe, from France to Germany to the UK or whatever, like this is not a large swath of area. So I guess maybe is it that you guys think that these startups maybe don't have the same support if you're just startup in France? Do you not have the same support that you might have in the US? And that also contributes to your runway. How hard it is for you to get up and running with some new AI technology. And we talk a lot about all the LLMs, by the way, and all this stuff that comes up in this show a lot. But just like we were talking the other day, all the different types of AI technology that are from military to infrastructure to bridges, stuff that like drones, things that aren't necessarily sexy, but they're definitely going to help no pun intended, pave the road going forward around the world. So I don't know. That's where my brain goes with this. What do you guys
I'm going to say that there's probably a capital issue here, which is VCs don't really like to have to invest in something that's in a foreign country. They want to be able to get in their car and drive to the headquarters of the office of the company they've invested in. They want to be able to supervise and support. And so that's in the VC world, that's well known as, an entrepreneur and going out and trying to find VC capitalization of ideas. I've had that experience where, maybe there's a VC in New York. I live in California. Maybe there's a VC in New York, but they're not as interested in me because, I have alternatives here. So I think the capital has concentrated in the San Francisco Bay Area for sure. And it may be that there's just not a really huge amount of capital in what is really now a center of excellence in AI, which is in, I believe, Paris, which is that company that's offering up the Mistral series of large language models, and many other there. But the total investment that's available is also a function of where is the private equity.
I think we lost Andy.
Andy froze.
I want to just expand on what Andy was saying is, if you look at what rules just came out, like there were I can't remember what the EU came out with, like the European, like AI intelligence, whatever act they came up with. There's a lot of people saying, hey, that's very restrictive, and that will either prevent or significantly push down the type of innovation that comes out of Europe, because you have to do a lot more and some of those rules, they make sense, but what you have to do to actually get to to bring forth your project. There's a lot of transparency you have to do, how you train your models, all those kind of things, versus the United States, where it's like, well, it seems like very, there's been a couple executive orders and a couple things in front of Congress, but there's no laws or rules that are coming out like very stringent. And especially in a, I guess you could argue, in a Congress that is very, very partisan, you're not going to get something. I don't know if you're going to get anything bipartisan that's going to come out that all three levels are going to sign off on. So I think it's because of that gridlock, you're just going to have more open, I guess, like less regulation here than in Europe.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's like, it's a bit of the wild, wild west right now. And that gives a lot of like first mover advantage, and it allows people to, have obviously more freedom to test things out, to throw things out into the wild before, government comes down on top of it. My analogy to this is firefighter, but Iraq firefighter, not domestic firefighter. But when we were over there doing contract firefighting, and it was in the most active part of the war, this is the Operation Iraqi Freedom and Liberty. When the firefighters were there before me, like, they put out a fire, everybody threw a parade, right? It didn't matter how the firefighters got it done, because there was literally incoming bombs and stuff. Now, I got there in 2009. Things had settled down comparatively to 2007 drastically. It was a much, much safer place for me to be as a contractor, right? And then what happens after that? Well, all of a sudden, it, like, no more parades for putting out fires. Now the government comes in and says, well, hold on, how much are you spending to do whatever it is? And what are we paying you? And all of a sudden, when things settle down a bit and it's not the Wild Wild West anymore, there's not only not any parades, there's a whole lot of government oversight that comes on top of that. And I feel like right now, when it comes to AI, it's like everybody's excited about what these LLMs can do and what's GPT-5 going to be. There was a quote yesterday from somebody apparently from internally at OpenAI saying the world is not ready for GPT-5. That may in fact be true. Whether OpenAI will hold that back or not, I'm not quite sure. It depends on, what they do. But I think there's probably some validity to that statement. But it's a bit of the Wild Wild West. So I do think, Karl, you're right. Like, I expect the government to catch up on this as things settle down a little bit. And then it's going to be like, well, how does this affect us and rules and regulations? So it seems advantageous right now. If you are thinking about doing an AI startup, this is the time, because you probably have the least amount of roadblocks ahead of you, the biggest chance to get VC backing, so on and so on and so forth. Like the ball, speeding up, rolling downhill. I don't know.
I would argue, I don't even know if this is an argument, but this is, again, this technology is the fastest. The pace of this is faster than anything we've seen. So you know how long it took government to crack down on social media? It was just like, well, it's been like over a decade, right?
Has it?
Yeah, has it cracked down?
Not even cracked down. Like, they just got Zuckerberg and made him turn around and apologize, right? Well, like, by the time, like, if you think about how slow everything moves from that point and how fast this is going, yeah, they can come up with rules, but it's like, how can you govern like all these things that are coming out? How can you govern like deepfakes? And how can you detect it? You can't enforce it, because part of governing is you have to enforce your laws. Well, yeah, it's fine if you have a bunch of laws, but like, who has the skill set to enforce these laws when everybody's learning as fast as they possibly can and new technology comes out? Then there's open source, where it's like, you can put the regulations on the big companies, but you can't put the regulations on just like Hugging Face, GitHub, whatever it is that just comes out. Like Mistral just pops up a torrent. Like, how are you gonna?
It is. You're absolutely right. It's the Wild West, and pretty soon there is going to be a cry to prevent open carry of AI. AI can, and that's kind of flip, but at the same time, having continuous surveillance that is a function of cameras on humans walking around, that are a part of their AI wearables.
Mm-hmm.
That's an
Mhm.
issue that's probably a subject for another show. But this is all about regulation and how does the world anticipate and respond to the major disruptions of privacy and lots of other issues, economic and other, that are coming about because of the very rapid development of AI capabilities that are driven by AI itself.
So, to a certain extent, what we're talking about is that uh, some of the dysfunction of the way that the U.S. works um, is to the benefit of this kind of development, and I would say that that's also true of San Francisco, right? So you hear about not only VC funding, but okay, if you can move your whole team here, we'll give you a house. Right. So now you have 6 months of funding, 6 months of mentoring, and a place to live where you're all together and you're in this little bubble. When
Right.
things are moving this quickly, we know because we're benefiting it because we're hanging out 5 days a week. When things are moving this quickly, the closer you can be to people who are also engaged in that pursuit of knowledge, of skill, of any of that, the more advanced you are. Plus, San Francisco has this history, right? So it's sort of laid the groundwork before to be in this right place at this right time, and now all of these things are kind of converging.
And it
Where,
has legacy capital right here. I mean,
right,
the treasure chests
right.
of individuals here who are available to provide private equity either as limited partners, or as individual angel investors is enormous.
The two things that I would say are different in this that are to the advantage of people who are listening is, as we said a couple of days ago on the show, on the Unicorn Show, you can do a lot with a much smaller team if you are creating your own AI employees or creating expertise in that context. And it's so much more like you can meet, you can engage with people in a virtual way, in a way that you couldn't 30 years ago, right? So you don't have to move to San Francisco. It's a huge advantage, but you can also, because of the pace of this, if you have something to show and you have a core group, then like where you are, you can kind of mimic some of that potentially.
I
I
think
think.
this brings up a good point too of, equity, which is to say that it's not it we joke all the time, and Karl talks about his access to Google and stuff. And Karl is just over the border in Canada. like geographically, he's not that far from some of us on this show, right? Or Aaron, when he joins the show, he's over in Perth, Australia. But it's not the same everywhere. Like I can sit in my house in Metro Tampa area where I live, and I can have very reliable, almost always up internet at massive speeds. And I'm also in a environment where paying the $20 a month to get access to the fastest speeds of ChatGPT is completely doable for my salary and my family and stuff like that. That's obviously not the case in large swaths of the world. So not only do you have like great, like Paris says we want AI companies to be here, or like what we saw in Miami when they wanted to be the not cyber but the crypto capital, right? They like pushed hard in that area, so you have these cities or whatever, you can say great, and then people go, okay, great, we want a center here. It sounds like Paris wants us here. They're going to give us free housing, whatever the case is. Oh, the internet is spotty. Oh, it's not nearly as fast as we need. It's not even the Ethernet speeds. It's down more than it's up. Oh, our workers, based on what we can pay them, we can only pay them X, and they can't pay $20 per month. That would be ridiculous. It would be a huge amount, a huge cost to them. So there's a lot of other barriers, I think, that are here for not just European, but anywhere in the world companies, because they don't simply have the same access to speeds, technology, costs,
Well,
things
that's
that
that's
we
going by the
clearly take for
wayside
granted.
now as a factor because of Starlink and other services that will
I,
provide high bandwidth
I
services
agree.
globally.
It's going down, but we're not there today. And Starlink is still expensive. I have family members who use Starlink because they live in the mountains. in the Tennessee mountains. They have to. It's better, and they pay for it because they do homeschooling with their kids. But it's
Did he
it's
go? Did
expensive.
he get lost too?
What's that?
He needs Starlink.
Did mine just pause?
Yeah, I
Did it
just
really?
said you need Starlink.
That's funny. That's funny that it did it right as I was talking about that.
There you go.
I saw you. You were smooth to me.
There you go.
It felt fine on my end.
Yeah.
So that's just Elon Musk with his finger. He's like, "Oh, really?" With his finger on the button. He's like, "Let's just slow down Tampa." Everybody in Tampa's like, "What the?" Stop talking about Elon.
Brian, all of Tampa.
Yeah, Brian again. Well, listen, as we're sort of like, bringing this back to whole, like, I don't know, is this, obviously this started, and Karl, you weren't here at the top of the show, but we were saying this from something you had shared, which was from the Palantir CEO, Alex Karp. And basically, this Axios article was U.S. eating everyone's lunch on AI, which I just love that title. And he has a quote in here that says, "A strong military gets stronger, stronger software companies get stronger, people who are in weaker positions get much weaker." And so is that, in fact, what we're going to see? Is the wild, wild west and the all this stuff we just mentioned about the competitive advantages the U.S. have, does that in fact mean that within 10 years, again, back to Alex Karp, 95% of the world's top tech companies will be American? Do you guys believe that that's the case? 10 years, by the way, is a massively long time.
I don't know about like all the tech companies, but if you have everyone looking at Google, OpenAI, Microsoft, all these models here, if you're looking at that, okay, fine, that's business use, everyday use. But Alex Karp, who is CEO of Palantir Technologies, who provides AI tech to defense, to the United States, if they are at the forefront, if these companies are helping the US military get even better than the rest of the world, which it already is by, I think everyone agrees, at least 100 times in terms of money spent, people, technology. So now they have, I would say they, because, still across the border, but you have this type of defense. Like, how can you, what is the ramifications of any other country that militarily you are the strongest, you have the best AI capabilities, that just puts you leaps and bounds above every other country, every other nation. And they're, yeah, I would say they're
there's a countervailing trend to that idea that having the best AI, even if it's just marginally better, gives you a significant and perpetual advantage in terms of military capability. Because right now you have this countervailing thing where the Houthis are out there in the desert and they're potentially going to swarm U.S. naval vessels in a way that overwhelms their anti or their countermeasures. So, that could happen as well. The democratization of AI may make it possible for even very small entities to have an outsized capability. And AI, as fast as it is, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it hasn't been implemented in such a way that it can countermeasure that.
Also, so one of the like, I think the biggest threat, and it's part of the work that I am doing, is increasing AI literacy. And the US, to a certain extent, because of the way that that our politics have come to sort of loggerhead, um, where it's kind of team based, right? Like red team, blue team. I would posit that the U.S. is in a deficit in terms of media literacy in general, and therefore AI literacy, and that also has an impact, and that's not something that our defense department has seen as a threat enough to do something about. There are different parts of the government that are looking at that as like, hey, no, this is bad for us. It's very, very bad. But there is also not an agreement about that to move forward in the same way that there is about defense in a physical way.
Just final thoughts. I'd say, Karl, to what you were talking about with Palantir, and what their CEO was talking about. It does seem that AI is incumbent supportive, just because they have the ability to move forward in large strides. And this is something that I was actually discussing with Faizan from Roll in our interview a few months ago, and his thoughts on AI in general. The companies that have, or the organizations that have already a place in technology and developing these technologies will have the foundations, or they'll have a stronger position to moving in. But to like Andy's point, with the democratization, I think we're going to still see lots of little players, and whether they join forces or there's a larger community that allows them to make certain inroads, I think the difference between the societal's catch up to technology's growth, that gap is always going to be there, and it's in that gap we're going to see like crazy paths just shoot off, and we're going to have these crazy examples of like, oh wow, where did these guys come out of, and those kinds of things. So we're going to get lots of surprises, but yeah, I think the steady, because of the incumbents, we'll see that steady growth overall in the industry, with large exceptions just popping off here and there. And again, Brian, 10 years is a lot. I can't imagine making a call from 10 years from now in the AI space. I think that's a little out there.
Well, I mean, thank God for Facebook memories, because I look at him and I go, that was 4 years ago. I think there's something really powerful about seeing where you were, several years ago, because it never lines up with whatever's in your brain about where it is. So yeah, 10 years, especially in this AI space, obviously we'll all still be doing this show. 10 years, and we'll continue to talk about it. Tomorrow we have our bi-weekly recap show, so we might talk a little bit about today, but we'll also talk a little bit about some of the other topics that we brought up and did shows about for the last 2 weeks. It gives us an opportunity to circle back when we have more to share there. Sometimes we talk about the stuff after the show and things don't make air, so it gives us an opportunity to do all that. That's tomorrow's show. Thanks for everybody today. Beth, Jyunmi, Karl, Andy, appreciate it. And we will be back tomorrow. Bye, everybody.
Aloha.